Hello, everyone, and welcome to this talk for MeasureSummit 2023 on customer data. What it takes to go from theory to production. Let's first do introductions. My name is Guillaume Ameline. This is me. I'm a co-founder at Human37. I'm based in Brussels, Belgium. I've been in the consulting slash analytics slash digital advertising space since around 2012. Today, I'm mostly working on customer data. That means customer data implementations, analytics, privacy, and customer data as a whole. That also means data warehousing, the whole infrastructure. And at Human37, we're not only focused on building infrastructure and geeking out on implementations, which we love, but also making sure that you get the value. So we'll always start with the business. In terms of background, I actually studied economics, which is typically the study people do when they have no clue what they actually want to do in their life. So that's what I did. My father was a programmer, so I've always been around computers and picked up on a few things. So I have no technical background officially. I'm kind of an autodidact, as we say it. I'm usually or mostly learning by trying and mostly breaking stuff. So that's me. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about customer data, how to go from this concept that is really big on customer data. I want to do something. I want this customer 360-degree view to actually a successful and actionable and ideally as well ROI positive implementation, right? What it takes you to go from an idea into actually something that makes it to production. What we'll do is we'll talk a lot about processes. I'll show you a tool that we use. It's very simple. We call it the user story canvas. It's going to be very practical because we're actually going to do a full example. And it's most importantly based on practice. These are exercises that we do with our clients prior to actually selecting any toolkit, any vendor, any technology, but actually helping them to set the requirements and figuring out like, okay, but how do I approach this project on customer data? How do I cut it up in tiny pieces? We'll talk about that later. And how do I make it actionable so there's actual value? It's not going to be a 200-page slide deck that you would get from any big consultancy firm with like 15 frameworks, 50 diagrams, and 30 graphs. No, we're going to try to keep it like applicable, operationally simple, because the objective is for you to learn something today and take it with you and apply it in your organization, ideally next week. So that's our objective for today. How do we come up or how did we end up with this presentation or this framework? I actually need to use the term framework or this user story canvas, which represents the framework. We've been doing this under the flag of Human37 for about 2.5 years now. And what we see is that every organization wants to be data-driven. There's this craze around data, that data is the silver bullet to solve all of your issues, and therefore we hoard data. There's a lot of additional factors contributing to that belief. If you're in marketing, there's the whole notion of third-party cookies disappearing, so all vendors are urging you to harvest first-party data, right? There's a whole thing of analytics and tracking, measurability, all of these challenges kind of make that everybody's trying to figure out what they need to do with customer data, how to get it, but most importantly, everybody's focused on we need to be data-driven using our own customer data. And what usually happens is there's an urgency around the topic. The customer starts looking for solutions, and every vendor in the market is seeing an opportunity to sell their tools, right? And so what we see is that more tools are being bought, but very rarely there's a good reflection on which type of technology do we need and how are we going to practically apply it. Basically, how are we going to leverage the license that we're actually paying for now, which means that in a lot of cases, technology remains a cost rather than something that is applicable to drive revenue. And the reason mainly is because people have a hard time defining exactly what they want to achieve, right? We see a lot of use cases when we talk or work with customer data around, we would like to have a customer 360-degree view. Our first reaction usually is that's great, but a customer 360-degree view is a means to an end and not an end on its own, right? What do you actually want to do? And that's where we, sorry for my language, kind of become a pain in the ass and pop open the user story canvas and force our clients to go through that framework with us in order to be very specific in what they try to be achieving in order to then be very precise in the requirements that they need to set for the solution that they're looking for, as well as making sure that they don't buy anything that they don't need. As a result of not doing this, actually, people buy the wrong technology. The use cases actually never make it into production because they're not real use cases. They're more like concepts or like means to an end, but there's no real ROI measurement positive element behind it. And the organization is actually stuck in implementation loops and cycles, and everybody's looking at everybody. And the only thing that they see in your Excel or your P&L sheet is an additional licensing cost. So what's the alternative? How do we make it from this concept of I want to do something with customer data into actually something that makes it into production? How do we prevent this from happening, basically? We always start, even though that we're very deep into tech, we always start with the business point of view. What do you would like to achieve? We start with the outcome, where a lot of organizations actually start with technology. There's always some company who did a Series C and is all over the press and they're solving the newest problem on the market. It doesn't mean you need to go buy it. What you need to buy is actually the thing that solves your problem. And in order to solve your problem, you need to be able to define it, right? That's why we work with user stories. Some of you might know user stories from development world or from the IT world. We use it in the customer data world, and it forces everybody to be very precise about the issue that they're trying to solve. And it has multiple advantages. We'll come back to that later. It usually also means that when a customer or when somebody starts with a customer data use case, we can derive it or break it down into multiple user stories. And if we have multiple use cases, we have a handful of user stories, and we call this the book of user stories. The book of user stories it sounds very theoretical. It sounds like you're boring us with another concept or with another framework. But actually, this is a very important step, right? It's like when you do analytics implementations, the result of your implementation is how good you thought through instrumentation. Analytics people will know this. It's kind of the same thing. We built this book of user stories because we would like to understand what are we trying to achieve, which helps us set requirements for your technology stack that you'll need in order to bring your customer data to life, to actually activate the data and take it from a concept or a use case to an actual actionable use case that will drive value. It also allows you to get going faster. We'll come back to that later. How do we get there? Basically using the user story canvas. I've mentioned the buzzword or the keyword, whatever you want to call it, a couple of times, and so I no longer will keep you waiting. This is essentially what it looks like. It's very straightforward. It's very simple. It's an 8-step exercise, and we'll do that together now. We'll go through this progressively. We'll use a fake use case or a very generic use case, and I'll walk you through the different steps that we go through, why we do them, what the reflections are, etc., etc., so you can get an idea of why the process exists and what it looks like. There's actually 8 steps. First, we start with the input, which is the use case. What's the overall idea you have? Then we break it down into user stories. There's a couple of criteria we want to check there. Then we go through the user story walkthrough. We have an idea or we have a conversation around which identifiers, and we'll come back to that later as well, a bit more into that, are involved, which systems and tools as a result are involved, which blockers and restrictions do we have in the environment or ecosystem that we're operating in. We'll usually draw a short blueprint sketch, like as a visualization, as a type of visualization actually to have an idea of how the stack might evolve, what it will look like. And then we'll talk very specifically on the data points we'll try to capture. So without further ado, let's go and move forward. Everything starts with a great idea, right? In this case, everything starts with a use case, a customer data use case. In this case, we're talking about the use case that some of our clients would have, and these are actual real use cases that we have, and this is briefings that we get as a customer data strategy agency doing operations as well. I would like to communicate to users in a relevant way. Right? We just grab now the user story canvas and we fill it in the first cell. I would like to communicate to users in a relevant way. If you're talking to me during the workshops or during these sessions, I'm going to tell you it's not really a great user story. It's actually not a very good. It's even a bad user story, right? Because it leaves too much room for interpretation, and it also allows for a million directions for the user story to be solved, which in the end could get you in a corner or actually not be able to satisfy your needs very specifically. And that's why we'll move through the user story canvas. Not everything starts with a great idea. Actually, everything starts with a great idea, but everything makes it into production using a great user story. And what are the characteristics of a user story? We kept it quite simple. There's only 3. User stories need to be specific. The more granular, the better. And you're going to tell me like, okay, Glenn, but if I go granular, I need to duplicate a lot of stuff. It doesn't really matter because usually talking through the granularity of a user story and breaking it down into these pieces and then say, I would like to communicate through email or through push message or through Facebook or through Google Ads or through TikTok. there's a lot of things we can cluster there, right? The most important is that talking through the granularity of user stories will allow us to identify a couple of work streams or variations in the user story that belong to a use case, which allow us to work on it and to understand, like, okay, this is the complexity. These are all of the variations and the variables that we need to take into account when tackling this user story. The second step is that a user story needs to be actionable. In a lot of cases, we get use cases where the outcome is, I just would like to know. Working in analytics for almost 10 years, I can tell you that just because I would like to know usually leads nowhere. For the simple reason because you're racking up a lot of data, you're racking up costs, and data is basically worthless unless you tie an immediate action to it. And an action could be, I would like to change my campaign optimization model. I would like to change my budgets that I attribute to marketing campaigns. Or I would like to use another variation of our onboarding funnel if you're in product. Or I would like to send an email as soon as people get stuck in a specific funnel, right? So that's what you want to do. You want to make sure that you tie an action to the user story and to the info you get. Otherwise, all that is worthless. Number 3 is make sure that your user story is measurable. What's the actual impact? What's the KPI you're trying to achieve? A lot of you might be aware of stuff like North Star KPI metrics, all of these trees where you have L3, L2, L1, and your North Star KPI metric. The objective is to figure out which of these metrics are we trying to influence by building this user story and actually driving business forward and upwards. That's why we always start with the business, right? Understanding how a user story that is derived from a use case can actually contribute to the business growing. Obviously, it's cool to put stuff into production because they're technically challenging or something, but very rarely it gets you to an ROI positive investment. So always try to attach a KPI to it or a metric. It's not always easy, especially in the case of personalization. You kind of have to look at it in the long run, but it's important to go through the exercise, I feel. Now, if we take this first user story, I would like to communicate to users in a relevant way, and I'm trying to make it specific, actionable, and measurable. We get some sort of a use case that is a very specific variation of this. I would like to track the onboarding steps in an efficient way so I can understand where users get stuck, so I can actively reach out to them using an email in order to guide them to the next steps, right? It's going to be measurable, and I see that I haven't noted it, but the conversion rate or the onboarding rate in this case, the objective is to get that metric leveled up, which ties into my North Star KPI framework, right? You can further develop this user story. Obviously, I could say to guide them through using an email, and I can mention my ESP, etc. Right? You could go as deep as you want, but you kind of feel like already this becomes something more solid. This is something that we can work on, opposed to I would like to communicate to users in a relevant way, which is a fairly to very generic use case. Now let's go back to the user story canvas and just map it in. I have the 3 boxes checked, or assume we have it checked. And so the next step is user story walkthrough. What is the user story walkthrough? The user story walkthrough is a very pragmatic, bullet-pointed version, if you will, of laying out what are the different steps that a user would go through or a customer would go through in this user story. So the user story is, I would like to track the onboarding in an efficient way so I can understand where users get stuck, so I can actively reach out to them using an email in order to guide them through the next steps. Sorry, it's very small. And basically, the user story walkthrough would look something like this. Well, there's a CTA on my landing page. I click on the button I get in the sign up initiated event, let's say. There's going to be a plan I need to select. I'm going to put in my payment details, and I'm going to click the finish button to get the sign up completed, right? So what we'll do now is we basically fill these steps in. A user enters the subscription flow and enters a credential page, completes the credential page, enters the payment detail page, and completes the detail page. Users enter the purchase finalization page. A user does not complete the actual purchase, and the user receives an email with detailed instructions. So basically, if I would go back one slide, what you would get is, doesn't really want to, apparently. Yes. What I would get is that users would be stuck between payment details completed and sign up completed, right? These are the things that we don't have. So that's what we're going to target users for. These people who are going through this specific scenario, completed payment details completed, but did not complete sign up completed would be an audience, right? It's already something that gives us a more tangible feel of how are we going to actually build this. The next step is actually to talk about user identifiers involved. And by talking user identifiers involved, we're also going to talk about systems and tools involved, because typically these go hand in hand. So if I would look at the user story, I would like to track the onboarding steps. The onboarding steps in our case, obviously it's a fictive example, so I kind of can freestyle, right? But it's only to illustrate, is happening on the website. And the website has a backend and a front end. Now, I'll be tracking this through some sort of a web technology, which means that there's going to be a cookie deployed, which means that at some point I'm going to have an anonymous ID, right? As long as I don't have any personal identifiable info, a user ID or an email address or something like that, I'm going to have a anonymous ID, which is going to be initiated as soon as the user hits the website. The next step of my user story is actually I would like to target people using an email. So the people who have completed the payment details but didn't complete the purchase selected, we would like to send, if you will, an abandoned basket email, because in the end, that's how simple it is. It means that I need to have an ESP, email service provider, or a CRM. I kind of split them out because not all CRMs or ESPs are the other way around, right? Imagine that they could be the same. But an ESP requires an email for a message to be sent, right? Otherwise, who are we going to send the message to? So we're going to capture probably at the payment details completed element. We're going to capture that email. So we have an email. If the ESP and the CRM are actually split, at some point, we're also going to have a user ID, right? Because somebody enters our ESP or our CRM, and there's going to be a fixed user ID attached to it. Why? Because the emails could change, and in that case, the user ID would be stable. Imagine something like that, right? So we're kind of dealing with three identifiers: anonymous ID, user ID, and the actual email. Now, the next step is to have a conversation around the systems involved, which we actually already did in one way or another, right? We talked about the website, SDK, front end and back. I specifically mentioned front end and back because if you're in analytics, and some of you who are actually very deep in analytics might know this, anonymous IDs typically on the front end, user IDs provided by backend systems, linked to logins, etc., usually live on the backend. So that's why we kind of tend to split them out. We have an ESP and we have a CRM. Why do we actually have this conversation? I'll come back to it later, because the user identifiers involved in this case are very simple, right? You could kind of solve this through a very light CDP or even in the warehouse or even within the ESPs, right? It's hard to tell based on this user story. But the identifiers involved, if this is the only user story you want to put in production, seem very simple. Imagine that later on we build another couple of user stories and we see completely different identifiers that are required. At that point, we might want to start thinking about how do we resolve identities, right? And that's why user story canvases are useful to kind of start listing. And as soon as you do more and more and more, you see different elements appear on the canvases, which allow you to, at some point, like consolidate or complete your business requirements. It also makes a lot of sense to kind of plan ahead, but not too far. I usually say, like, let's try to envision user stories that we can put into production within 18 months or something, which for a lot of organizations is already a stretch. But it forces us to think through more complex use cases, which in a lot of cases might even involve a lot of different identifiers and as a result, different systems. The next piece we need to talk about is blockers and restrictions. Why do we need to talk about blockers and restrictions? We need to talk about blockers and restrictions because usually we don't live in a fairy tale world and there are blockers and restrictions. A couple of examples are, well, we're close to Black Friday, so we have a complete code freeze, which puts everything back. We can't deploy in this area or this season. Same for Christmas, same for promotional sales periods. It could be that a specific system isn't connectable and we need to build a custom connector, or we see a need for a custom connector, which becomes a requirement potentially for a vendor you'll be selecting or for something that you'll be building. It could be that some of your elements in your stack aren't up to date. You might want to need an upgrade of your database in order to do something, or because the database needs upgrading, this user story needs to be backlogged or something like that. It could also be that you just don't like the people in IT, or you have a quarrel with them, and it means that they don't want to work with you. Whatever fits, you put it in here because it's important to have that awareness, not only technically but also organizationally. If there are 15 boards you need to go through in order to get access to a specific data set or toolkit, please also map it here. Next, we'll go through the blueprint sketch. The blueprint sketch is a very high level drawing, if you will, that we make of how a stack could be composed. We talked about the sources being the website. I've made a free will variation here, obviously, but it comes with a front end, it comes with a back end. The front end and the back end will be sending data to what we call today a middle layer, where we'll be building that audience, right? We talked about the audience that is stuck between payment details completed and sign up completed. So we need somewhere to build that audience and then to actually send it to the ESP. I call it a middle layer because it could be at this stage a million things, right? It could be a CDP like Segment or a Particle. It could be a native data warehouse solution. It could be a reverse or composable CDP, reverse ETL or composable CDP solution like Census or Hightouch. Any of these things could actually work. So I just called it a middle layer. And based on how the user stories will develop further and the more user stories we have, we actually could fill up this bucket of how the middle layer would look like. And based on the needs we actually have. I mapped in the CRM just for the sake of the user ID. It's kind of trivial at this stage. Next, what we'll do is we'll map this in, and the next element is the last one, which we call data points captured. We already kind of had a sneak peek on that, but usually what we do is we assume that everything is going to be event-based. There are variations of that, but usually it makes a lot of sense to talk through taxonomy or figure out like, okay, how are we going to name these different milestones? How are we going to work through it? How are we going to track it? Why? Because most of the technologies these days for measurement, and we talked about client-side SDKs in our user story here, they're going to be event-based. If you take GA4, if you take any CDP SDK, if you take Mixpanel, if you take Amplitude, even Snowplow to some extent, most of them are event-based. So it makes sense to approach it as an event-based measurement element and actually pin down which data points do we need in order to isolate that audience that gets stuck between payment details completed and sign-up completed. So here we have kind of a visual representation of that funnel. We have a CTA selected, sign up initiated, plan selected, payment details completed, and sign up completed. And what we'll do is we'll tag using small post-its. What we add are a couple of properties. And so that means that we could break out the CTA that was selected by the CTA type and actually make a sub-audience using that, using the anonymous ID, remember. We could even subset the people who selected plan selected using the plan type, or using payment type or payment plan. This is classical event building structures or tactics. What we do next is we turn this into some sort of a tracking plan, which is an overview like that. It helps us to get a very operational and visual overview already, even though we're very early in the process, right? We're building our book of user stories to potentially either immediately put them in production or to alternatively first go out and select the right technologies in the market that fit our needs. But it makes sense to kind of have an idea on using this because it walks us through these user stories. It's basically the technical requirements from a data tracking point of view in order to put this user story into life. Doesn't need to be perfect because we can always tweak it, and it will be tweaked as more user stories develop, which we then call part of the data catalog, but that's for another time. We add the data points captured in our user story canvas. And then basically that's completed for one single user story. So what do we have now? We went from a very high level use case. I would like to communicate to users in a relevant way to a very specific user story, which basically says, look, I would like to figure out which users are stuck between payment details completed and haven't finalized their final sign up. These users, I would like to understand who they are. If I have an email address, I would like to send them an email in order for them to understand how to complete their sign up. I have an overview of the different steps. I have a visual representation of what the stack looks like. I have an understanding of what my identifier list looks like, which systems will be involved, if I would be hitting blockers or not. And I even already have like a mini tracking plan to understand like, okay, these are the data points I need in order to get there. And if you paid attention, we actually have more data points than we need because for this particular user story, I could just use two. I could use payment details completed and sign up completed, right? But this will serve other user stories later on. So this is one canvas. Now, what's the value of a book of user stories? Now, the more of these user stories we'll be compiling and the more pages our user storybook will contain, the clearer it will become on which type of choices we'll need to make, right? In this case, we have a very simple identity graph, if you will. We have an anonymous ID, a email, and a user ID. If it stays like this, we could actually handle this through a very simple or light CDP or even analytics implementation, right? These are typically things that some product analytics tools would be able to handle because they have connectivity with certain ESPs. They are able to use email as a trait or as a user property, whatever you want to call it. And anonymous ID and user ID are de facto components that you need in those setups, right? So that could be a direction. It could be one way to solve the user story if you have mixed panel or amplitude, for instance. If it would become more complex and we would add like a CRM ID and we would add a Zendesk ID and all of these type of things and a phone number because we're a large organization, we also provide phone support and would like to drag that in based on other user stories. It could be that we need complex identity graphs or identity resolution engines. This immediately puts us into the path of either we buy a CDP off the shelf, which then comes with a lot of other questions we need to ask ourselves, or it can be resolved into the data warehouse. Either we build it or we buy it through solutions like high touch equivalent. Um, I don't have the answers here because I only have one user story. The purpose is to show you how to fill in a user story canvas and to show you how it can guide you to bring clarity on a lot of the questions that a lot of organizations have. Because typically, a lot of organizations start with the question, should I go build something or should I go buy something? And if I buy something, should it be on top of the data warehouse or should it be a packaged CDP? Or should it be an analytic solution that can take care of it, right? They typically start with this layer that comes later for us. And the user stories are a way to actually evolve that thinking and make it clear. That's the first use case, or that's the first purpose at least. On the other hand, you have this the second section, which is the blueprint and which is the data plan, and it raises the question: where does the data come from? Which systems does it come from? Um, what does it look like? How are we going to ingest it? Is it already in the data warehouse? Because it could be in my graph, for instance. I said, well, the data is coming from the website to a front-end SDK. It will be the front-end SDK, but potentially you already have Snowplow or something equivalent, or a RudderStack or a high-touch event stream hooked up to your data warehouse, and the data is in the data warehouse. At that point, your blueprint will look fundamentally different, and you won't need an SDK anymore, but you'll need something to unify the data and pump it out. Where if you don't have an SDK, you might want to ask yourself other questions. And I see that my face is kind of in the way. Can't move it, sorry. Um, but do we have everything that we need in order to get there? Do we need SDKs? Don't we need SDKs? So based on the variations that you'll see in the different user story canvases that are filled in, and as you work through them, you'll see that some elements might pop up or might never pop up, which makes certain questions very answerable very quickly, right? It's the objective is to give you a direction in what the infrastructure should look like in the first place if you don't have one yet. The second part of user stories is actually to accelerate your go-to-market, meaning the value you generate and the fact that your license actually starts making money rather than just being a cost for you. Like typically the cycle is the following. We analyze user stories going, or we analyze use cases actually using the user story canvas. So we go from use case to user story and then we completely write them out like we just did and we iterate. So we built this book of user stories. We prioritize these user stories based on the current state of the infrastructure, the feasibility, and the blockers that we have. So we can define the stack requirements. If you already have a stack that functions for you, this framework is still valid, right? Because it's part of the analysis and making sure your user stories go to market. If you don't have a stack, user stories are a very, very good way to actually set your requirements according to the business cases you want to put into production. What we then do is we deploy the stack incrementally. A lot of people think that you need to go through this 6 month or whatever multi-month period in order to implement everything because we want to track and we want to tag everything. The user story I just showed you is actually fairly easy. We need 2 data points to be tracked and we need 1 connection, which is the ESP, right? So it allows us to say that this user story in its current state and without any further context on other user stories is very feasible. So we can prioritize it. It means that it could be part of a first set of events that will be implemented, and it could potentially even go live in a couple of days, right? The interesting part is because we have a book of user stories, it means that a lot of the analysis already has been done to set the requirements or to actually build the catalog of user stories, which means that a lot of the pre-work has already been done. So as soon as you decide to sign off on a license, or if you already have one, to go into working on these user stories, a lot of the pre-work already has been done. We have an understanding of what we try to achieve. We have an understanding of which identifiers we're expecting. We know which systems they come from. We've identified blockers. We kind of have an idea on how to connect things, and we even have data points and a naming taxonomy if we did our work right. So it allows us to be ROI positive more quickly. We've seen customers like implement literally days after signing off on any license, like things in production, either through a composable CDP on top of the data warehouse, or even a packaged CDP, because we only needed a handful of events in order to put these first things into production. And this allows, or this kind of highlights the second piece or the second advantage of working through the user story approach. First one was it allows us to set clear requirements in case you don't have all of your components of your stack ready yet. The second piece is that it allows us to create value really quickly as soon as everything is in place, because a lot of the pre-work and the analysis has been done. We kind of know what we're doing or where we want to go. So closing thoughts, because we're at the end of the presentation, I would urge you or recommend you to at least go through the exercise of building a couple of user stories as part of your user story catalog. And to do the homework. Don't just blindly buy technology because somebody did a series C or D and they're making a lot of marketing noise or whatever, and they're yelling and screaming, but do your homework. Licenses these days aren't coming very cheap, especially not if your business is growing. So try to make good choices as well by doing this work. Try to figure out or understand that you can work incrementally. You don't have to build everything at once. Rome wasn't built overnight or in a day, whatever the expression is. It's the same with your stack. Try to figure out how you can incrementally roll out user stories that are of low effort, that require minimal input or minimal development, but that still keep you on track to develop in the long run. And the way you know that is because you've analyzed a couple of user stories that give you the direction where you need and that set the technical requirements. And this allows you to accelerate the time to value. Closing thought, or the one-liner for me that I want you to take away with or go away with, is that your stack should be the sum of all user stories you would like to put in production, because that's the objective. We're trying to build better experiences, and better experiences are best translated, as far as I'm concerned, into user stories. So go on the lookout for these experiences that you want to build. Try to be very specific in your user stories, and you'll build an amazing catalog of things that you want to achieve, and the technology stack that you're looking for is actually the thing you would want to build, and not something that you buy because there's a lot of noise around it. I hope this was useful. If you have more questions, find me on LinkedIn, find us on human37.com, or come to our booth at the MeasureSummit. Bye-bye.